deterrent something or other, I'm sure.
So it's been 12 whole years since the original release of Dead Island, and while Riptide released just 10 years ago, it was met with a much more mixed review set. And indeed, while these titles have had a remaster/definitive edition in the interim period, there has been a long and turbulent wait for Dead Island 2. Techland moved off to make the Dying Light games, very good zombie games within their own right, though certainly having a much more serious feel than the Dead Island games. Jaeger was originally brought on to work on Dead Island 2, but they left the project in 2015, and the game has actually been finished up by Dambuster Studios, who perhaps had one of the most difficult jobs of picking up where everyone else had left off, and they're an internal studio of Deepsilver. But their hard work has paid off, and while Dead Island 2 is not without its flaws, it's an enjoyable jaunt through Hell A, and while not fully open world, its variety of locales more than make up for this. Let's dive a little deeper, shall we? Now, in terms of the story, without giving too many spoilers away, the game takes place in Hell A, or Los Angeles, where there's been another zombie outbreak. You begin the game with other survivors on an evacuation plane, which is promptly shot down, and you must find another way to escape Hell A. Along the way, you will meet an interesting array of characters, from extremely posh and self-important actors to influencers, dapper old gentlemen, and pretty much every other trope you can think of. And even with the game's overall humorous overtones, it has some serious messages mixed in, and at times manages to bring the drama, albeit with a very much Hollywood action movie feel. Many of the side characters which you will encounter via side quests bring a very interesting and amusing view on modern life and internet culture, and some things certainly hit home for myself as a content creator. Some of these characters you meet are honestly engaging enough that I wished you saw more of them, or indeed the story made more use of them. Whereas others I would gladly feed to the first zombie that comes along. Perhaps that's fairly realistic to real life. It is definitely my conclusion that some of these characters are a little bit underused, and at the same time the reality is the game can't simply go on forever. The only final comment I would make about the story, without giving any spoilers, is that it's left pretty open-ended, I assume for DLC, though it feels a little sudden and in some ways without tying up all those many loose ends. In fairness, this is done in an effort to ensure you can continue playing beyond the end of the story and go back to do all the additional side quests, as some new stuff does appear, so there is a reason for it. So when you start the game, you have a choice of main characters. There are 5 to choose from. All are individually voiced and come with their own attitude and style, as well as a variation in stats and base abilities, though honestly I'm unsure how much difference the stat changes would make overall to the combat. Perhaps it's more about the personality of the character that you would like to play. I ended up playing the game through with Jay, the British chap who is in a lot of the promotional material for the game and is basically the first choice you come to. Kind of fitting for me being British myself, I guess. His commentary throughout the game was well thought out for the most part. He had at least one choice word in one section, which, well, to put simply, does not always mean what they seem to think it means, and I was rather shocked it was in there in this day and age. But certainly overall the commentary and the interactions were very humorous. There are certainly funnier bits than others, but I really do recommend doing all of the side quests, as you will get to hear a lot more funny dialogue. I would note it's definitely worth visiting different areas at different times of the day. You either have nighttime or daytime, and different quests will spawn depending on whether it is day or night. Moving on to the gameplay, let's focus on the combat, because realistically it is a major part of the game. It does have one major flaw. In the initial stages it gives not a lot of guidance, and you can easily assume that most of the combat is a very straightforward hacking and slashing affair, without any extra to it. In fact, compared to the first game, I was seeing very little dismemberment. It was not actually until multiple hours into the game I gradually realised all of the different melee weapons had almost special attacks when using their heavy charged attack on different parts of the zombie bodies. Axe in the abdomen, ripped up through the chest, metal claws through the face, machete shoved through the abdomen, twisted and ripped out. You get the idea. None of this was really explained at any point, and I just found it through trial and error. And I think the lack of an explanation of this really let the game down early on, because it really coloured my view of the combat, and I actually felt quite negative about the combat early game. And speaking to some of my friends who'd also picked up the game, they too hadn't realised that you could do this stuff, and they were further in the game than I was. That says to me there's a problem with the game's tutorial and or instruction early doors. But on the bright side, it does get a lot better once you realise you can do all this stuff, and it becomes a lot more entertaining. Outside of the base melee weapon attacks, you can also throw all of the melee weapons, which will have various effects when they land. Some will get embedded, some will simply bounce off and do some damage, and obviously if they have mods and upgrades, they can interact with other things which we'll get onto shortly. I should note that you also have some dodge, block and kicking abilities. Without spoiling too much, you will gain more at various points, and you can switch in and out with your skill cards, which again we'll come to in a bit. Though you can certainly manage without any of this. For example, the default dodge key was Alt, and well, I just never remember to hit it due to the awkward placement. Now, a big element of combat is the environmental interaction. Water, fuel, caustic chemicals, and canisters of all kinds litter the environment, as well as there being various sources of electricity and fire to aid in your combat. Now, in complete fairness, you can probably keep everything very simple and hack and slash your way through most of the enemies, but it really pays off to use the environmental and status effects, and there is something quite satisfying about setting up an elaborate trap with various layers of these objects. Though be warned, relying on this too heavily may be your undoing, as later in the game more special zombies appear with more resistance to these various status effects. As noted a little earlier, weapons can have various mods installed, both elemental ones which interact with the previously mentioned water, fuel, etc., but also special ones based on zombie parts later in the game. There was something deeply fun and enjoyable about having a lightning claw and slamming it into the face of various zombies. You also get a range of curveballs, which are basically ranged weapons such as grenades or throwing stars, which come in various forms. Again, these can be used in conjunction with the environment to set up traps and apply status effects. And yes, obviously there are guns. No, they are not the be-all and end-all, but certainly good in an emergency, and admittedly towards the end of the game I found the assault rifles very handy for dealing serious amounts of damage to the bullet sponge bosses. There are various hidden unlocks for pretty much everything throughout the game, so keep your eyes peeled. I also recommend doing all of the side quests, including the ones after the end of the story. I know for a fact that I've missed some of these secrets and unlocks as I've gone through the game. There are plenty there for me still to go back and find. Now, one of the only negatives about combat for me would be that some of the enemies were simply bullet sponges, in the sense that they just take a lot of damage to kill. It also seemed that if the standard zombies were a level or two above you, they took a significantly larger number of hits to kill them than if they were the same level, almost like they were deliberately made harder to kill, perhaps trying to push you to stay in the previous areas to level up more first. Now, what I would say, to be completely fair to the devs, is I don't know if it is truly artificially done like that, or if it was just a psychological thing, but it was certainly noticeable to me, and seemed noticeable to people who were watching me when I streamed the game, that they were seemingly harder to kill when they were just a level higher, compared to when you then leveled up to match them. I want to take a moment to talk about the abilities. Now, I don't want to say too much about them because, you know, spoilers, and it's fun to sort of find them out on your own, but basically they are handled by playing cards that unlock as you play the game. Some unlock via the storyline, some unlock in the environment by just finding them, and some are rewards for specific side quests, etc. I would say read all of the cards in detail because some of them need other cards to activate an ability before those cards will then have any effect on that ability. That might be confusing now, but it will make sense when you play the game. Honestly, when it came to the ability cards, they were all okay, but there was nothing that really stood out as being amazing. Overall, I would say the majority of them were meh, and you just kind of took something to fill the gap. Another big aspect of gameplay is the world you are in, I suppose. It's split into smaller map sections rather than one large open world map. On the bright side, this allows for some very different environments, from fancy houses built in the hills all the way to the beach side and into the sewers without having too much open space travelling between. I guess that also ruled out the need for vehicles. Transfer between some of these major locations is done via the underground systems, be that sewers, underground trains, and that made for another very different style of gameplay environment, and indeed threw a spanner in my works of relying heavily on the electricity-based weapon mods, because if I'm stood in a sewer that's full of water, I'm going to electrocute myself. It should be noted that the main story quest will not take you to every location inside these areas, so like many of these games, it is left to you to explore at your leisure if you wish to do so, and obviously gain any hidden rewards, and going back to places after you've been through there with the story will often reveal other side quests. One or two areas dragged on a little bit, mainly some of the underground areas, and one of these, while long, seemed to have one significant area that was underused, and I wonder if this may be part of a possible future DLC. You'll know when you get there, but I was expecting some kind of massive boss fight. And when you do get there, let me know if you felt the same way in the comments. There are two last things I'd like to mention about gameplay. One of these is fuses. Fuses are something that are hinted at throughout the game, but you never actually get given any. You have to buy these, it seems. These fuses unlock rooms which have various loot in them, namely ammo, building materials or crafting materials, and they have a chest which will spawn a weapon, and as far as I'm aware, it is always a weapon of your level, and it is a pink weapon. However, I do think the game remembers that you've opened these places, they stay open, and the boxes stay open, and you can't get a weapon out of that chest again. Though there are plenty in the game, so don't be afraid to open them up. The second thing I wanted to mention are puzzles. The game has a few with a mixture of getting through traps or jumping up on certain objects to find a slightly hidden box. It also has a couple of these sections where you have to adjust pressure levels in pipes. Now, honestly, I think they could have done without those sections. The pressure level in pipes thing, the first one was sort of okay and it kind of made sense. After that, it was just kind of a jumble of guesswork, and honestly, I think the game could have just gone on without that being there as a roadblock. The final thing I'd like to say on gameplay is more of a tip than anything else. You will never run out of money in this game if you sell some of the weapons you pick up. Make sure you hang on to some of the blue weapons and just sell them to vendors, and you will have plenty of cash. Okay, in my reviews I always do a little section on graphics and sound. Now, the game kindly includes a streamer mode to remove any copyrighted music, which I think sadly does cut down the variety of music you will hear during gameplay. Overall though, the sound quality is fine, with the voice acting being the highlight of this section. Environmental sound works well, especially at night, to keep you on edge. Otherwise, while the sound is fine, it's nothing to necessarily write home about. Graphically, the game on the other hand can look exceptionally pretty. It has a variety of locations, and that really helps with this. During the daytime, all of these areas have a very individual look, and all of the zombies wear different clothing depending on the area you're in, so there's a really good variety. At nighttime, however, things generally look pretty much the same everywhere. Yes, you may notice there's a couple of areas where things are lit up more. I don't want to say too much to spoil the story, but certainly there are some areas that benefit from nighttime more than others. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention probably one of the most outstanding parts of the game when it comes to the graphics, which is the dismemberment and gore. Obviously, your mileage may vary here depending on how quickly you realise doing heavy attacks targeted at certain parts of the body has more of an effect on this. The last thing to mention is probably the character animations. Some of it seems to be very high quality, especially early in the storyline, and you don't really look at it and think, oh, I'm watching a character that's being animated. It's just kind of going with the flow. Later on in the story, I felt like some of the side characters weren't flowing quite as well, and I felt like the animation wasn't quite as solid, especially on lip movement and things like that. It certainly doesn't get to a stage of being bad, it just seemed more noticeable towards the end of the game. In summary, Dead Island 2 was a fun jaunt through Hell A, with some familiar character tropes and a few modern twists on the classics, making it at times a very engaging game story-wise. I really have to commend the game for its dialogue and the voice acting. It was all done very well, and some of it was extremely humorous. The game overall is much more light-hearted than the likes of Dying Light 2, and I think it's to the game's benefit that it was like this, as it sets it apart. The only shame was that there are some characters that came and went in the blink of an eye, and nothing further was explored with them, and I think that was a missed opportunity. Combat by the end of the game was a lot of fun for the most part, bullet sponge enemies notwithstanding. The game could have done with a few more explainers early on, as it took trial and error to realise there was more to the combat than it first appeared, which I think let the game down a little at the start by slightly colouring my opinion and the opinion of the people who were watching my game. However, once you actually realised what these heavy attacks were capable of and that they did extra things and all the interactions that were possible, it really opened things up, and making use of the environment was a lot of fun. If you like a good hack and slash zombie game with plenty of humour and an interesting cast of characters, aka more like Zombieland than I Am Legend, as well as some really brutal gore, then it's certainly worth a look. You will not be disappointed. Overall, I would score the game a solid 4 out of 5. The loss of that additional point is because the game really lets itself down early on by not explaining the combat better, and also the bosses were generally just bullet sponges, and I think that's a real shame. I do wish they had adapted maybe other mechanics so that you could do extra damage to bosses in certain situations, something that we've come to expect from a lot of these types of games. But that's not to take away from the fact that it was a fun experience. I am going to go back and play more of it because I want to do the other side quests and see what else there is to unlock. So I've enjoyed my playthrough, and I'm actually quite keen to try it again with a different character. If nothing else, just to see what humorous dialogue they come out with. Please do let me know what you thought of the game down in the comments below, what you think it did well, what you think it could do better. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Please do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all soon.